Hi guys, I'm Peter O'Shea from ESB, Head of Corporate Affairs and Regulatory Policy in ESB. Look, it's been a great start to the session. I thought Paul's presentation was excellent in terms of very comprehensive of what we got to do. You know, in ESB, we're fully bought in to the Climate Action Plan. Fully bought in terms of what it means for our generation business, in building onshore and offshore. Fully bought in terms of what our networks business needs to do for all generators in the marketplace. And fully bought in terms of, as a supply company, helping to change customer views and helping to get customers engaged in this process of decarbonisation. And I suppose I might just put three things out there for the session. I think firstly, you know, the 10 years ahead of us is actually very short. There are two regulatory price controls in those 10 years. There's the price control the ESB Networks is engaged in now for the first 5-year period and a price control for the second 5-year period. Both of those are crucial, particularly the first one. And I would urge IWEA and its members to support the submissions that ESB Networks is making to ensure they have the wherewithal to help deliver on this massive challenge we're facing. The second thing I mention is, and Stephen mentioned earlier about the importance of backup. You know, without doubt, to get to 70% renewables by 2030, we've got to be able to have the cold winter day where 95% renewables is on the system. And I'd be very confident in the work the ERGID have done in the past that they'll crack that challenge and they'll be market-leading, world-leading in that. But in addition to that, we have to be capable of meeting demand on a cold November day when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And the wind might not blow and the sun might not shine for a period of a week. And we need to be able to deal with that, right? And I don't hear enough conversation. I welcomed the piece earlier and welcome Paul, David mentioning Baringa later on, and I might be able to hold on for that. But I think that's really important. The third piece, and call out to everybody in the room, right? To me, the raison d'etre for the wind industry is not about putting up turbines and us building transmission lines to deliver that energy. We have got to put the industry foursquare in the middle of decarbonising Ireland. And when you look at where the emissions come from in Ireland, only 20% of the emissions come from electricity generation. There's also 20% from transport, and there's 20% from how we heat our homes and how we use heat in industry and business. So if we can decarbonise electricity and then use that clean, green power supply to power our heat and our transport sectors, but then electricity is no longer 20% of the problem, it becomes up to 60% of the solution. And I think we have to capture the imagination of our public around that. We won't capture the imagination by building turbines, talking about building turbines and building transmission lines, but we have a chance of capturing their imagination if we can put the industry foursquare in the centre of how Ireland plans to decarbonise the entire sector. And I fully agree with the comment that 2030 is a starting point. The plan has got to be get to 2050. So there may be the three pieces I would urge IWEA to pick up on. And in that third piece, electrification of transport, there's two reasons why I think that's, and heat, two reasons why I think that's really important. Firstly, to deal with the curtailment issue. But secondly, to get that engagement with consumers. So I think it's really, really important.
Very good, Peter. Thanks. John.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. John Riley's my name. I'm the head of development, Bord na Móna Powergen. And again, like Peter, you know, Bord na Móna is full square and very much welcomes the government's climate action plan, and we want to play our part as an organisation delivering that. And I think it is really important to recognise that the reason for all of this, as Peter has referred to, is the role that we can play as a sector or an industry in the energy transition. And the acceptance of that energy transition, even here domestically, is growing right now, and we need to tap into that. Without a shadow of a doubt, we need to tap into that. And if you look at from an EU perspective and a national perspective, I think there are 4 pillars to what will mark out an efficient energy transition. First of all, you have the policy piece, and I think as you've referred to, Peter, and as David referred to, that's done. That's done both at an EU level and a national level. The ambition is there. It's very significant. So that job is done. The second thing is around this whole area of governance and efficient governance and a regulatory framework, making sure that the network operators, that the regulators, the people that have pieces of the jigsaw to play are working in a coherent way where we move away from the stuff that Paul has shown us in terms of processes that are lined up back to back and we get them integrated. The other two things are the bits that worry me, and Peter has referred to them. The market design piece is a bit that I really, really worry we're not going to get right here. And from the point of view of the delivery of all the bits, the flexibility around the power system, the backup that will be necessary to meet whatever that 30% is, whether it comes from new technologies or existing technologies, that conventional thermal piece, who is going to invest in that right now? The way the integrated electricity market across Europe is designed right now, the answer to that, in my view, is nobody. And so the current market design at a national level, European level, is not fit to deliver 70% renewables in the Irish context by 2030, and that needs to be addressed. And the final piece that Paul has referred to, the obvious one, the big one. Without network infrastructure development, we don't get there. I think we're all agreed on that. And I don't want to bring up Grid 25, but I feel I have to. Grid 25 was, in its day, the right idea. The principles behind Grid 25 were about enhancing the backbone of our network. Right now, we need a Grid 30, or is it a Grid 35? And that the principles of that need to be delivered soon. And to me, that is the single biggest barrier. I'll finish by saying I was incredibly encouraged by Mark Foley and Mark's leadership in terms of EirGrid and the EirGrid strategy. Mark is pointing the organisation in the right direction. EirGrid are crucial to this. ESB networks are crucial to this. The problem we can't wait till 2022 or 2023 to see what that plan is. It needs to be delivered now.
Very good, John. Mary,
Yes,
Europeans' perspective. Yeah.
My perspective, well, firstly to explain that I'm the chair of Renewable Energy Ireland, which is a relatively new acronym, if I wish, REI. And what is Renewable Energy Ireland? It is, in fact, a collaborative platform of sustainable energy associations. So I don't know whether you've been following Brexit or whether you've got totally bored with the discussions, but 2 weeks ago when they were talking about the negotiators going into the tunnel, there was this report in one of the British newspapers that a journalist was asking some of the people in Brussels, where is the tunnel? Where is the tunnel? And it was a little bit difficult to explain to him that there was no physical tunnel. It was, in fact, a state of mind. And Renewable Energy Ireland is also a state of mind. It's not a physical entity, it is a state of mind. And it's about bringing people together to work together to deliver on this energy transition. And for that reason, the participation in Renewable Energy Ireland, obviously there are generators, wind, IWEA is there, Irish Wind Farmers Association, offshore wind, solar are members as well, but it's also the demands response side. It's the heat side, the services of the energy transition, because what we're actually trying to do here is to understand the services that we get from energy. And we get 3 services from energy. We get heat, which is 40% of our energy. We get transport, which is 40% of our energy. And we get power, which is 20%. And of course, in this audience, we tend to talk about the power, which is the 20%. But there's these 2 other ginormous services that, in fact, people and our society and our economy use. And those are the services that ultimately will have to be decarbonised. And electricity, if it is decarbonised, you're right, can be a solution to deliver results in those areas. But they can't deliver the results in those areas without full participation by everybody. Yes, you need government policies. Yes, you need the industry here to invest. But you also need the population, because the reality of renewable energy is that it is small scale and it is disparate. We don't have a big money point, a single solution that's going to solve the problem. We will end up with lots of wind turbines spread throughout the country. We will end up with solar panels spread throughout the country. We will end up with lots of small solutions in terms of storage. Some of it will be batteries, some of it will be something else. Unfortunately, there isn't a single solution here. It's lots of little pieces that have to come together. And as part of that, we also need the population to participate. We cannot achieve this transition without the people, the society, community, and indeed industry participating in the exercise. So I think when we look at some of the challenges that we are confronted with, I would say one of the biggest challenges is turning energy outwards towards the population so that the population understand what's going on and ultimately can support and be part of it. So that's what we're about in REI.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, and it's very important to keep us engineers a little bit more grounded in the reality as well. We do have to bring the people along. Peter, your perspective.
So Peter Lefroy, Project Director for Energy. So we're developing onshore and offshore assets in Ireland. I'm focused on the offshore side of business, also chair of the offshore committee in IWEA. So I mean, I agree with everything that's been said to date. I suppose I'd like to add to sort of Marie's point about that, getting that buy-in from people. And I was at a session recently where people were talking about the transition, and the point was made that this transition is slightly unusual in that the end point that we get to arguably doesn't deliver anything tangibly different from where we are today, in that the lights are still going to burn the same way, we're still going to get to work at the same rate. The cost of energy is arguably not going to be substantially different. What we're talking about doing is achieving the same thing in a substantially different way. And this is about transforming the way that we do that, and we're looking for all of the various stakeholders to fundamentally change the way they interact with the energy system, and really make very substantial changes to how they do that. And that requires buy-in, and it's not only the regulators, the system operators, the generators, it's also, as Marie says, the public. And it's a very complex area to communicate, and I think that presents a very difficult but interesting challenge to the industry for how we communicate our role within that, and how we get buy-in for what we're trying to do in that transition. I think Paul's analysis was really excellent. I want to commend him for that. I think as generators, we are facing a really significant challenge in how we deliver that pipeline of projects and navigate our way through all of those various regulatory and policy constraints to get there. But I'm certainly very optimistic that the people in this room and the people in other organisations and the various stakeholders are capable and able to do that.
Very good, Peter. And okay, I'm hearing a lot of agreement here, but let's test it a little bit here. Paul set out in his slide. He said we're going to do twice the megawatts in half the time, and he's shown in engineering terms what policy changes would need to deliver that. But let's drill in a little bit hard and say, really, can we actually pull that off? And I'm thinking, John, here in particular, you have a lot of experience with On Board Pleanála here, and Paul set out what we need to do there. We need to reduce the planning, the success rate in SID by at least double the success rate, halve the time. We need early engagement. Can you see that On Board Pleanála has the resources, the time, and can you, as a developer, see yourselves working that much differently from what has worked to date for you?
At the moment, no, because we're still in a situation where what has been for the last decade or 2 decades is exactly the way we're doing things. I think there's 2 practical steps that need to be taken to perhaps enhance what's going on there. First and foremost is resources. On Board Pleanála, there's no point in us talking about organisations like On Board Pleanála or Airgrids or Networks without, as Peter's referred to, these organisations must be given the resources to deliver this. That's absolutely critical, and that's probably about headcount and various bits and pieces. So that needs to be sorted and should be sorted quickly. I think the second thing is, in fairness to On Board Pleanála, where you get well-grounded applications, they have shown through the SID process. We, for example, got a wind farm decision in 7 months. And one of the key pieces to what we see going on right now is the clear policy direction. The clear policy direction, in fairness to the planners, when they look at things and things get contentious, if there's a clear policy direction in terms of where we're going, and the government's climate action plan and the targets within that, from my perspective, both of those pieces should help. Cracking the nut around where the courts get involved on the judicial review side is a real problem. That to me is the bigger issue, and I really am not sure how we take that element of the timeline, where it occurs, out of the picture, because that is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most challenging element on the consenting side. It's not necessarily with the planners, it's with the appeal process in the courts.
I would have to agree there, and you know, one of the functions maybe was if we can't fix the court system, at least if a Port Manola can make decisions quicker and maybe you amend and go back in and repair it in time, and maybe that's what helps. Peter, you had a view there.
I agree with what John has just said there in terms of the planning system. I'd have this sort of outlook. I always look at the glass being half full rather than half empty, right? I'm not saying John's seeing a half empty glass now at all, but just looking back at some of the numbers over the last 10 years, right? So if you take the last 9 years, including 2019, in 3 bunches of 3 years. So 2017 to 2019, we will have connected in the region of 600 megawatts, average of 600 megawatts a year onto the system. The previous 3 years, the average was around 240 megawatts. And 3 years before that, the average was 150 megawatts onto the system. So when you look at the rate of connection, the rate of improvement that's happened over the last 9 years, that's significant, right? That's really significant. So if our capability, if our capacity to connect is at the 600 megawatt level now, and if that can continue, notwithstanding where we are with planning and with projects in readiness and you know the dash for 2020 brought on by refit, but if we can continue that level, well then you know the extra 4,000 to make up to the 8,200 of onshore wind has to be within reach. I think the bigger issue is probably offshore, and you know we need to crack on with the MAFA bill. I can't get the new into my head at all, but MAFA, you know what I mean, the marine offshore bill. We need to crack on with that. And put in place the licensing and the consenting mechanisms and the industry structure to deliver on what is a big challenge, 3.2 gigawatts offshore. That's a big challenge. Well, although another way of looking at the glass half full is that it's one Dogger Bank. So look, I think it is doable.
Well, let's dive into the offshore a little bit, because obviously we have Peter here. I mean, I think we're at that delicate stage where so many of the policies are uncertain. It's difficult to kind of analyse what can and can't be done. Peter, do you think the industry has set out clearly what can be done in realistic timelines, or is it pitching too high in terms of what can be done?
I mean, I think there are significant development opportunities there. I suppose we're in an interesting time in that we're transitioning to this new competitive type market, and naturally all of the developers are sort of working towards that kind of a competitive setup. So there's natural positioning of projects and who can do what and so on. I think what you're seeing though is a move towards larger, more experienced developers coming into the market who have experience of building in other jurisdictions, have delivered significant levels of capacity. Energy is only one example of that. And they're bringing not only that capability of bringing projects forward, they're bringing the financial capability for what are very significant projects. They're bringing the best industry practice from multiple jurisdictions to be able to deliver that. And they're also bringing a supply chain, or hopefully bringing a supply chain that can deliver those turbines and that technology to us. I wouldn't underestimate the challenge, as you say, and has been said a couple of times here. You know, we have a very good climate plan with a very good target of where we want to get to in offshore. There are a number of actions there that set out a pretty high-level framework, but there's a significant level of detail still required in terms of what's going to happen in the early years for those existing projects, how quickly that enduring regime can get set up so that more projects can deliver in different parts of the coast to 2030 and beyond 2030. And I think in a broader point, you know, and it's been said before, but I think it's worth reiterating, you know, 2030 is just a milestone on our way to a zero carbon goal. You know, we can talk about all of the various policy measures in which the panel thinks are the key areas, but, you know, at the end of the day, we've got to achieve short-term wins, but also within the context of where we're trying to get to in the very, very long term. Can't forget the short-term wins, but we've got to future-proof what we're doing now so that we can continue to deliver that significant capacity over the years.
And I guess the common issue for onshore and offshore was the rate at which the grid is developed and so forth. And obviously, it's one of the key questions here, and we'll come to the specific question. But maybe Mary, just in an international perspective, how are other European countries doing with this grid delivery? Places, you know, has anyone cracked this problem of getting the high voltage lines to shift the really, really large amounts of power across their countries?
I think looking at what has happened in other parts, and Germany was already mentioned today, I mean, they've changed the legislation 3 times. They have thrown money at it. They're now prepared to put it all underground, regardless of the cost, and they still can't get the citizens to buy into it. And that's why I keep coming back to this issue of the transition, this energy transition. If you don't have citizens with you, it would be very, very difficult. We talk about offshore wind, the legacy projects on the east coast. Clearly, we need them. The government is behind it. But I can promise you there are people living in Dalkey and elsewhere in Dublin who will die before they will have wind turbines in their view from their living room window. So the resistance that's going to be manifested, for those is very real, unless you manage to get a situation where, if I take as a comparison Copenhagen, where in one of the most expensive districts, they have not only wind turbines right beside them, but they have the incineration site. The biggest incineration site in Europe is right beside them. And the Danish population can accept that. They don't see it as a negative. They see it as a reaffirmation of the sustainability of their society. And that's the kind of message that we need to communicate to the population in Ireland so that they understand what it is that when they turn on the lights, there is a connection to that wind turbine out there. Money is part of it, but it's much deeper than that. It's an understanding of how the energy transition is taking place and what it means for everybody. And Dublin is going to be particularly sensitive because the East Coast, much of the energy is going to go offshore. And up to now, Dublin really hasn't been confronted with this because all of the wind turbines have been built in rural Ireland. So you now have a situation where the Dublin population is going to be confronted by something that's very new. They're not going to like it. And the message has to be delivered and in a way that allows them to buy into that process. Because otherwise, you'll get the policy, you'll get the legislation through the House, you'll get money. In the end of the day, policy and money, you'll get them. It's time. You get them sooner, you get them later, you'll get them. But moving people is a very big obstacle. And I think that's one of the issues that's really going to be a problem going forward.
So if we can't move the people, what's the plan B? I mean, the most popular question on the list here is, we've been here before. EirGrid tried major grid development. They tried to build the 400 kV lines out to Mayo, Cork to Dublin. They had to back down. At the time, I think the industry dodged a bullet because they had some useful other tricks up their sleeve around operating existing lines. And in the end, we got to our 2020 target without too much impact from that. But I think the chickens are back to roost at this stage. And Peter, I suppose just thinking there from your point of view, you've been involved in building lines, delivering lines for a long time. We heard earlier from Stephen how the price of wind is plummeting. Is it time to think really big and raise the undergrounding question again? Just how much of this can we underground, or should we even consider undergrounding?
Well, I think all those questions are valid questions, but I go back to what I said at the outset. I think if our discussion with the general public is about building turbines and building transmission lines, well then I think we'll get the reaction we've had in the past. We've got to broaden this discussion. This is about decarbonising Ireland. This is about safeguarding the future for our children and showing where electricity fits into that. And going back to what I said at the very outset, if you can decarbonise electricity and use the power, heat and transport, instead of dealing with just 20% of Ireland's emissions, you could deal with up to 60%. All that's left then is agriculture, and we're there. And our children's future is safeguarded. I think that's the sense I picked up. That's certainly the sense in the ESB strategy, and it's the sense I picked up in the EirGrid strategy as well, that we've got to position this as something much bigger than just our industry. Because when people look at our industry, they see us as developers looking to make a few bob by building turbines and building transmission lines. And for so long as it's seen as that, I think the reaction we'll get will be difficult.
Okay, that's fair. John, as a developer, if we're going to get this grid built and know where we're putting it and get engaging with the public early, so that we can't be seen to rush this if we're going to win the hearts and minds for these lines. The current process, as you know, actually now requires that you've planning permission for your wind farm before you even get to engage with the system operators about where your project is and how to connect it. How are we going to change that around so that we can actually permit the wind, as Paul said, and the grid, starting from the same starting point together?
Unfortunately, it does require, in my view, a Grid 25 type approach, where it's no secret. We have done a lot of good work. EirGrid have had applications in. It's no secret about where the bulk of the onshore stuff might be developed in the next 10 years. We've progressed quite a bit, I would suggest, in terms of understanding what that looks like. So in terms of designing the increased capacity on the high voltage network that's required, I think that's infinitely doable. And that needs to be done in parallel with the Hearts and Minds story, because we don't, in my view, we don't have time to take 3 or 4 years to begin a process of winning the Hearts and Minds and then delivering the network piece. If that's the way we're going to approach it, we will not achieve 70% by 2030. It's as simple as that. We've got to go back to that principle. And I think the other important issue here is, my sense of it is, again, this is not about tens of thousands of kilometres of high voltage power line. It's a small number of relatively big strategic projects like we had in Grid 25. And I think we've got to establish what that looks like. And it's not about necessarily having the discussions with the communities in those areas. It's about the buy-in of the entire population for the process. And I think that's the only way we will be able to deliver things in the time frame that will be necessary to ensure we hit 70% by 2030. I firmly believe, by the way, that it is possible technically in every other way to get to a net zero electric power system in Ireland by 2040 at a relatively efficient cost. But we need to start moving at that now.
Very good. Peter.
Yeah, I was having a talk recently given by the head of Tenet. And for those who don't know, Tenet is the cross-border German-Dutch TSO. And they deliver offshore connections for German and Dutch wind farms. And it's a centralised connection policy. You connect in an offshore connection point, and Tenet delivers the offshore infrastructure so that you can connect in. And the conversation was talking about how in the early days when they were setting up and they were doing their first connections, and it was almost a case that there were a number of projects in the North Sea that were being developed and were hopefully going to be delivered. Tenet had to make a decision to go ahead and start investing in the grid infrastructure without the certainty that the projects were going to be there. And the question came from the audience as to how that conversation went with the government and with the regulator. And he turned around and he said it was a very, very simple conversation. The government said, this is policy, we're doing it, we know the projects are there, we want to develop in the North Sea, go and spend the money and we're happy to take the risk until such time as those projects come. Back to what John said, we know roughly within a reasonable level of certainty we're going to be building offshore off the East Coast in the next period. We're going to be building in certain parts of the country onshore. We know what areas of the transmission grid need to be upgraded. We know that investment needs to be made. We can't wait for, a developer to come along to underpin that investment in the network. We've got to start doing it now.
Excellent. Okay, well, we've covered a lot on grid. Turning maybe to just the power system more widely, we've got a top question here for refer to the thermal assets for non-renewable energy weeks, the calm week, the non-sunny week. Is gas the answer, or is it thermal hydrogen? What are the solutions here when we go to the really high penetrations that we're talking about? Peter?
Well, I'd have a view. I think gas has got an important part to play in the transition, as we move towards a fully decarbonised system. I think hydrogen has come up on the radar massively over the last 6 months, 18 months. But the fundamentals of hydrogen are the same as they were 5 years ago when it was when it was up on the system. One interesting piece on hydrogen I read, it's a report by the IEA back in June of this year. And right now, at a global level, we produce a massive amount of hydrogen on a global level. It's something like 3 to 4% of all the coal and gas in the world right now is used to produce hydrogen. And 98% of that hydrogen is produced using steam reformation or gasification of coal in a very dirty process in terms of the environment, in that the carbon is just pumped to air. And 2% is produced using electrolysis, right? So the question that this report is asking is, maybe a first step on a hydrogen economy would be to convert the 98% that's produced using steam reformation to produce that using electrolysis. And it concluded that we would need a generation capacity to do the electrolysis the scale of all of Europe's present capacity. So that's where it says to me there's a lot of big numbers at play here in hydrogen. I think hydrogen certainly is going part of the mix. And I think the fact that the bar is shifting in terms of full decarbonisation rather than 80 to 95% decarbonisation puts hydrogen back in the spotlight. But there are some fundamentals there that do need to be considered and worked through, because that law of big numbers, even if you double the efficiency of hydrogen production through electrolysis, it's still a very, very big ask. But I think for natural gas, I think natural gas has got a role to play in the balancing of the system out to probably 2035, 2040. I personally would like to see CCS develop further. I think there are no options we can afford to stand down, particularly in Ireland, because we have limited options to meet that extra 30%. So I think there is a role for natural gas as a transition fuel into the future until we find the final answer for that 30%.
Okay, interesting that there's that much weight on the hydrogen. Just for the rest of the panel, just your views, testing that a little bit. I mean, we're looking at the car manufacturers and transport. I mean, I think you'd have to say the bulk of the investment is going to EVs at the moment. I mean, Toyota are down the hydrogen route, and I guess BMW dabbling a little bit. What's the rest of the panel's view on whether hydrogen has a role to play in the transport sector rapidly?
Well, if I take just one or two illustrations, I mean, Europe has spent a small fortune on the hydrogen fuel cell, developing it as an option. And it's interesting that Japan, as a policy, has taken hydrogen on board as their preferred fuel for transport. And they're rolling out the hydrogen fuel petrol stations, if I can call them such, in Japan. In Europe, we have very few member states who are looking at the hydrogen network on the motorways, for example. Because ultimately, the real attraction of hydrogen is long-distance travel. That you can fill a tank like with petrol and diesel. So you'd need the power station, the hydrogen stations on the motorways. Germany is looking at a few, France is looking at a few, Spain, but no other member state. And just as a small, I mean, the figures change, of course, but if you have a petrol station and you want to put in a new petrol tank, pump, shall we say, that's about 10,000 euros to put in a second one, third one, fourth one. If you want to put in a gas tank, pump, it's about 100,000 euros. And if you want to put in a hydrogen pump, it's €1 million. So that's just the order of magnitude in terms of the infrastructure cost, rollout cost for hydrogen in transport going forward. Plus, at the moment, hydrogen cars are very expensive because they haven't yet managed to bring the cost down. So I don't say it won't happen, but at the moment, the costs are very difficult on hydrogen. But there's a lot of, I mean, hydrogen, you're quite right. I mean, I would have said 3 years ago, hydrogen was in the corner, it was far too expensive, was never going to be right. It is true to say that the cost of electrolysis has fallen dramatically in the last number of years and is projected to continue to fall, like the technology cost reductions for wind turbines and other things. And that starts to make hydrogen, at the moment, I was saying to the colleagues there, I was over in the Shell Technology Centre in Amsterdam recently, and they have solar panels on the roof, they have an electrolyzer in the basement, and they have 2 hydrogen tanks. And they're currently able to produce hydrogen at 20 euros a kilowatt hour, 20 euro cents, I should say, at a kilowatt hour, which, of course, from a heating perspective is far too expensive. We're currently paying about 2 or 3 cents for it. But for transport, it starts to become interesting. Is that the direction of travel in Europe? It's very hard to say it would be. At the moment, I would say the policy is neutral on hydrogen, although investing still a lot of money in the research. For transport, it's much more EVs for passenger, because that's an achievable technology, it's known, and it's the route to market there is quite clear. And it's still looking at things like biofuels as an option for heavy-duty transport. But if I can, just one small comment on EVs, and it's a particular issue for Ireland. We don't manufacture cars in Ireland, so we can import them. And whether we import pink cars or blue cars, it really doesn't matter to us. But given the direction of travel over the 70-30, we will need the batteries in our electric vehicles as a support to the grid going forward. Imagine Christmas Day, nobody's driving anywhere. We all have our ovens on and the Christmas lights are on and we're watching TV and, the power surge is there. We want to be able to draw the energy from the batteries of the stationary cars. But that means we need to use only electric vehicles that are geared to vehicle to grid. And as a policy position, I believe Ireland should only subvent those cars, those electric vehicles that are vehicle to grid enabled. because if they're not enabled for that, they're not adding to they're not solving the problem in Ireland.
Excellent. Very good.
Just one thing on the
John.
hydrogen side. The other thing that I think is interesting on the hydrogen side, my view is that conventional gas, that flexibility is provided by conventional gas, will absolutely be required on the power system by 2030 and 2035. And as we move towards 2040, things may change. So it's how that flexible gas capacity, and when I talk about the market piece, it's also all the flex tech bits around that. How's that all going to be delivered to ensure that the power system is flexible enough to accommodate 70% renewables by 2030? But the interesting thing about the gas piece is, if that gas turbine technology is there, will we be burning hydrogen in power stations to provide that flexibility? And from my perspective, I think that's the next step beyond that. That's already been looked at by many of the companies, the OEMs that produce these types of technologies. So that flexible gas bit, particularly in the context of Ireland, is absolutely crucial. And how you stimulate the necessary investment in that piece of the jigsaw is crucial, in my view, to the market design piece. If we don't get that, we will struggle to get the flexibility into the power system.
Just add one thing to that. You can't take methane, natural gas, bring it to the power station, CCS it at the power station, and inject the hydrogen into the turbine.
Absolutely.
And again, that could be an answer that's out there in the future. But the point I made earlier, we can't close the door on any of these options, because the challenge is so big. We got to keep the door open all of them and see which one emerges over the next number of years.
Excellent.
I think I might just very quickly add to that. I mean, in terms of offshore specifically, and hydrogen does present a sort of an opportunity in the long term in terms of large-scale offshore off the west coast, where we don't necessarily have the capacity to build all of the infrastructure, the grid infrastructure to transmit that across the east coast and interconnect across. There is that model of converting that electricity produced into hydrogen. There are a number of pilot projects. RWE, our parent, is involved in one in the Netherlands, and that certainly does present an exciting opportunity.
Absolutely. I do want to get to some of these questions, and there's one there that's been floating to the top for anyone on the semi-state side of the world. John, would you be able to take this one? Getting back down to the detail again, where there's third-party access or access required to get across semi-state lands for third-party developers of projects. How do you best approach that issue?
Yeah, it's an issue that's becoming a bigger challenge for us now, because we have so many projects potentially being developed on lands bordering our lands. We have a myriad of requests for option agreements and wayleaves. So the system we had in place in the past, where we had a small number of those, simply isn't going to work in the future. But where we can clearly see that projects are real and are moving and progressing from a grid perspective, Bord na Móna won't be found wanting in terms of providing that access. But we are a commercial company. It has to be done on the basis of a commercial agreement. In relation to our wider land bank, I think one of the things that you're likely to see Bord na Móna doing, given the opportunity that's afforded to us by the climate ambition, is we've done a lot of what we've done to date on our own. I think as we move forward, we're likely to be seeking larger strategic partnerships to deliver on the opportunities that we have. So all of that is tied into that land bank piece, and I think we'll be coming forward with a strategy in that regard, I guess, in the next 12 or 18 months.
Very good. Back, Peter, I think we possibly covered it, but maybe let you respond directly to that question. Is ESB fully bought in to decarbonisation?
Well, I'm sorry if it feels that we're not, right? Because I can tell you that we are, right? Absolutely. And look, just some proof points, right? So we're investing in the Oriel wind farm. We're going to develop that wind farm over the next number of years with Park Wind. We bought into the Galloper offshore wind farm back a couple of years ago. It's been generating offshore wind for the last couple of years. We're progressing Grouse Mountain Owenini this year to conclusion. We have several hundred megawatts of wind on the system. We're looking at e-heat and we're looking at e-transport. We have a business unit looking at e-transport. We've got a charging network across the island of Ireland to provide charging for electric vehicles. We're looking at how we can use electricity to heat homes. And to me, like, the big question is actually not about the 20% of carbon in the electricity generation side, because if that's all that Ireland does over the next 10 years, well, then we've missed the boat. We have to look at that 20%, but we have to look at the 20% carbon that's coming from the transport sector and the 20% of the carbon coming from the heating sector. And I think we're probably the only organisation in Ireland looking at all three and progressing options in all three. So I'm sorry if it doesn't feel like it. It certainly feels like it to me.
I think that's fair. sorry. I was going to direct their next question there, Mary, but just picking up on the role there with communities again and getting communities engaged. We've heard some of your ideas there, but just take us through the sort of just transition concept again.
So, I mean, engaging communities, and when there are two groups of people here. There's communities who are formed into entities. That's one group, and then there is the community, which is everybody, regardless. And the exercise of engaging everybody is a real challenge. And if I could suggest, I mean, there are a number of very small things that could be done. I don't know how many of you have looked at your electricity bill recently and what information you get on your electricity bill. It all comes in kilowatt hours, I can tell you. In other parts of Europe, when the bill comes, there's a piece that explains what your electricity usage has been for, or what the electricity usage in your district is, and whether you're using more or less on average. Or, for example, a new form of, let's say, a washing machine is available. And so, in other words, the electricity supply companies are using the bill as a method of communication with consumers at a point in time when the mind is a little bit open to think about electricity. So I think that is an opportunity that we can use better in our system. It's a very simple thing. It's not a big deal to do it. It's a very simple thing to do it, to get that message across. I think there's also the issue of, is there a county in Ireland, apart from, say, Dublin County itself, that doesn't have a wind farm?
I think of one or two.
Well, Dublin doesn't have, I suspect, but
Yeah.
but virtually every
pretty
county
small.
in Ireland, has a wind farm. To what extent, are these wind farms, and you're probably doing this in some places, but maybe not in a coordinated way? Is there an open day or an open weekend where the whole country is invited to come and to see these and to feel them and to touch them and to listen to them, and where kids can, see what's happening on the ground? But it's done on a coordinated way so that you get quite a big bang for your buck, that you're actually opening up to the population so that they can see it and feel it. I mean, it's a PR exercise, but it's not a difficult thing to do. I think the other issue is, I think you're absolutely right, Peter, we have to move away from electrons and kilowatt hours into the services. The services coming from energy. It's really, that is the message we have to get across. And in the end of the day, what a householder, let's say, or even a business wants is, I want to be able to work in a nice, comfortable climate. I don't want to be cold. So I want my temperature to be, at 19 or 20 or 21 degrees in the building. Take care of it for me. You do that, that's fine. I'll buy a service that gives me thermal comfort in my house, and I don't want to know how you do it. And then you have your aggregator, who basically has the capacity to manage the flow of electrons into and out of, for those who are generating them, the entity, and to get the best deal. And you offer the best deal to the customer for the services that they're going to get, not for the electrons that they're going to buy. So it really does mean a new form of conversation with people that basically uses their conversation, their language, rather than the engineering language.
Perfect.
Peter, just to say, we as we know, we have developed one of our wind farms in the Midlands, an open access policy, and we've developed what started out as a small learning hub there. But I think to tell people the amount of engagement we're getting through that. Just yesterday I was down there, and the group that we're visiting, we typically started off getting a lot of schools and educational bits and pieces, and that was fine. But ever increasingly, we're getting a wider and more diverse groups from the population. Yesterday, we had a vintage car group down there. We've had senior citizens groups. And that's why I'm saying I genuinely believe that the public is significantly more engaged now. They do want to understand how electricity is produced and how it's made and what impact they're having. And of course, from our perspective, what we did was we put this thing right in the middle of the wind farm. We've opened it up to people and said, come on ahead, because as you're passing through the wind farm, effectively the plan behind it was to normalise this thing. they're not particularly noisy. They are big, they are what they are, but you know, it is working tremendously well for us. And up in Mayo with ESB, we're jointly developing a project up in Mayo. And again, we're positioning a visitor centre there with the expressed intention of telling the energy story, the energy transition piece, and trying to engage the public in that. And I genuinely believe the public are in a space where they do want to be engaged on this matter, without a shadow of a doubt.
I agree fully with that. Just an example now, for the last number of years, we've opened Ardnacrusha as a visitor centre across the summer, so June, July, August. And for the last couple of years, demand has outbid supply by a long shot. We've had 10,000 visitors over the course of this year. And again, it's down to that inherent interest that people actually have in the sector, inherent interest in the climate part of the sector, and to see Ardnacrusha as part of the legacy of the sector, but also a very positive part of the legacy. So I'm not surprised that you're getting great visitors in Mount Lucas. I think it's a great place for schools to visit. It's a great place. It's really topical, and I think it's part of how we engage with communities.
I think might just very quickly, the other part of that is we as an industry also need to not be afraid of having those harder conversations with the people who are not going to be on board with this. You know, you're not going to get into a position in a community where 100% of the community are on board. Don't hide from that. Deal with these people up front. Be open and honest with them. Be respectful with them. You know, agree to disagree. Put forward all of the benefits that we feel we're bringing to the energy system, and as I say, deal with them in a respectful manner. If you do nothing else, you will gain sort of credit for doing that.
Very good. Look, I don't think we can finish on a better point, the optimism, but with a little bit of realism there built in as well. So look, excellent. Thank you very much for a very wide-ranging topic. We weren't sure where we would go. That was really good to get those perspectives. If everyone could just join me in thanking our panel for that.